I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, who's that new gardener at Holy Family Catholic Church? He looks familiar. It's me, Father Jayme. During these weeks of Easter, when we celebrate the resurrection of Christ from the dead, we have all sorts of stories of people who don't recognize Jesus. Do you remember that story on Easter morning? When Mary Magdalene found the tomb that was empty, the first person she saw was the gardener. And she said, "Excuse me, sir, but they've taken my friend's body. Do you know where he is?" She didn't even recognize that the gardener was who? The risen Christ. Do you remember the story of Jesus appearing to his apostles? On the day of the resurrection, they were out fishing again. They went back to their old life, and he was on the shore, and he called out to them. Did they recognize him? They didn't recognize him. And in today's gospel, Jesus doesn't even have to dress like a gardener for the friends that he's with not to recognize him. Sisters and brothers, do we recognize Christ in our lives? Because I have a feeling that sometimes Christ comes to us disguised in many ways, right? Disguised like our gardeners or those persons in our community who are working in the midst of this pandemic. Disguised in the face of those who are suffering right now from this pandemic and their family members. It's not as if Christ is so clearly seen. Christ is often disguised in others. In today's first reading, Peter recognized the presence of the risen Christ. How it was that even though the people had crucified him, God raised Christ from the dead. And that friend that he once denied, he was now out proclaiming that friend's name. How cool is that? That Peter recognized Christ. In today's second reading, a reading that we often thought was attributed to Peter, even though written by another person in his name, it speaks of Peter going out and saying how it is that God raised Christ from the dead, so now we must live our lives with reverence. When you hear the word reverence, what do you think of? When I hear the word reverence, I think of things like genuflecting. We reverence the Blessed Sacrament. When we come into churches and holy spaces, we genuflect. We put our right knee on the floor. That's a sign of reverence. Or when we come to the altar, did you ever notice that those who proclaim the word, and even the priests, what do when they come around the altar? They reverence the altar. They bow to the altar. During the Eucharist, when we hold up the body and then the blood of Christ, the priest after that reverences the body and blood of Christ. When's the last time you reverenced Christ in others? When's the last time you bowed in the direction of others? Our sisters and brothers in Asia, they do that as a sign of their reverence for others. They recognize something special about those people. Do we recognize the presence of Christ in those around us? Or is it like that gardener that Mary Magdalene saw in the Easter Gospel? Or like those two friends of Jesus today, who even though he was walking right beside them, they didn't even know it. Brothers and sisters, today's gospel is incredible Because today's gospel is what we are all about as Christians and Catholics. Every time we hear the word of God proclaimed, we are following the footsteps of those and hoping to recognize the presence of Christ, finding our hearts burning within us because Christ is present when the word is proclaimed. And when we break bread together, what do we recognize? The presence of Christ among us. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, for those of us old enough to remember the 1960s, said that when we gather, Christ is present in the word proclaimed, in the bread and wine, in the presence of the church's minister, but also in the faces of those people beside you. So take a look at that person beside you. Take a look at that person in front of you, and behind you, Christ is there. If only we have the eyes to recognize him.